The invitation arrived on a crisp morning, sealed with deep blue wax and an insignia that whispered of nobility. Lady Helena Armitage, celebrated poetess and scandalous anomaly in London's literary circles, had been summoned to recite at the Duke of Ravenshire's grand banquet. A curious honour, no doubt, but one that sent a sharp chill down her spine. Because if the Duke truly knew who she was, what she was, he would never have invited her. Helena traced the elegant script with a fingertip, her dark brows furrowing. Why, of all people, would Matthew Devereux, the elusive and untouchable Duke of Ravenshire, take interest in a woman who had spent the last 3 years dismantling the very aristocracy to which he belonged, line by clever line, verse by blistering verse? Was this an olive branch, a trap, a mere whim of an arrogant man? "A curious turn of events," murmured Olivia, her cousin and ever-faithful accomplice, as she leaned over Helena's shoulder to read the missive. "His Grace is known for his disdain of social frivolities. If he's hosting a banquet, let alone inviting you, there must be some grand design behind it." Helena sighed, setting the invitation aside. It wasn't that she feared the Duke. It was that she feared the past. And Matthew Devereux, whether he realized it or not, was woven far too deeply into it. Still, she was not a woman who fled from a challenge. And if Ravenshire believed he could summon her like a trained pet, he would soon learn otherwise. The Duke of Ravenshire had not intended to invite Helena Armitage. In fact, had he known the poetess everyone whispered about was her, he would have burned the parchment rather than sign his name to it. He stood before his study window, jaw clenched, watching the rain mist over the gardens. It was Viscount Redgrave, his closest friend, and the unfortunate orchestrator of this entire debacle, who had persuaded him that a literary performance would lend his banquet an air of culture. "She is the most sought-after poetess in London, Ravenshire," Redgrave had argued. "You want to impress the regent, do you not? Then you must embrace a touch of modernity." Matthew had agreed, half listening, until Redgrave had carelessly tossed out the name. Lady Helena Armitage, and just like that, his past had come clawing. To the surface, sharp and unrelenting. The night of the banquet, Helena arrived at Ravenshire Manor with the practiced composure of a woman who had walked into enemy territory before. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle, all golden chandeliers and polished silverware, the air thick with the scent of candle wax and intrigue. She had barely stepped inside when a hush fell around her. Whispers, stolen glances, a poetess in a ducal ballroom, a woman whose works had upset Parliament more than once. The irony was delicious. And then she saw him. Matthew Devereux stood across the room, his broad frame stiff, his expression unreadable. His dark brown hair was neatly styled, his steel-grey eyes fixed on her as if she had materialized from a nightmare he had long tried to forget. Her heart thumped once, twice. Oh, this was going to be interesting. Helena held Matthew's gaze, her lips curving in a way that could have been a smile had it not been laced with something sharper, recognition, defiance, and worse, amusement. She had the audacity to incline a delicate brow as if he were the one out of place in his own ballroom. Matthew's grip tightened around the crystal glass in his hand. She had not changed, not in the way that mattered. Still dark-eyed and sharp-tongued, still radiating that untouchable confidence that set her apart from the powder and lace debutantes fluttering around the ton. But the last time he had seen her, she had not been a poetess. She had been a secret, his secret, and now she was standing in his house, beneath his chandeliers, dressed in sapphire silk like a queen about to make a proclamation. "How curious," came her voice, smooth as silk but laced with something undeniably wicked. "A man who loathes poetry has invited a poetess into his home. Tell me, Your Grace, do you intend to listen or simply endure?" A murmur rippled through the guests nearby. those pretending not to eavesdrop. Matthew took a measured sip of his drink. He would not play her game, not tonight, not ever. Some might say I invited the poetess, not the woman, he replied coolly. Had I known they were one and the same, I would have reconsidered. Helena's lips twitched. How fortunate, then, that your ignorance has spared you that regret. The words landed like a blade wrapped in silk. He had almost forgotten how quick she was, how effortlessly she turned conversations into duels. But if she thought she could unsettle him, she was mistaken. Your reputation precedes you, he said, tilting his head just so. I hear your verses are uncompromising, she smiled, a slow, knowing thing. You mean to say dangerous, Your Grace? Matthew did not smile. That remains to be seen. The air between them crackled, and for a moment the rest of the ballroom ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, standing at opposite ends of a battlefield neither had ever truly left. But then Redgrave, damn him, clapped a hand on Matthew's shoulder. Ah, I see you've found Lady Helena. Excellent, excellent. I trust you are already deep in conversation about the power of words. He chuckled, oblivious to the tension that could slice through bone. Helena's eyes gleamed with mischief. Indeed, His Grace and I were just discussing the impact a few carefully chosen words can have. Matthew exhaled slowly. He was not a man who allowed himself to be baited, but Helena Armitage had always been the exception. The evening pressed on, and soon the moment of performance arrived. The crowd gathered in anticipation, fanning themselves, murmuring about whether the infamous poetess would dare say something indelicate in the presence of such esteemed guests. Matthew leaned against a marble column, watching her ascend the small dais at the front of the room, watching as the woman who had once been his greatest mistake, his greatest regret, prepared to open her mouth and wield words like daggers. Helena took a breath, and then she began. And within seconds Matthew realized something chilling. This was not just poetry, this was a warning. Helena recited with treacherous calm, each word falling into the hall like drops of poison dissolving in wine. They call him noble, but nobility is a cloak, a mask of silk to hide the smoke. A man may be titled, a man may be grand, yet what is he worth if built upon sand? Matthew felt his spine stiffen. Those words, they weren't about just any man. The murmurs among the guests grew. Some ladies lifted their fans to their lips in barely concealed shock, while gentlemen exchanged wary glances. Everyone pretended not to grasp the meaning behind those lines, but Matthew knew, because that was his story. Helena continued, her dark eyes holding his like a huntress who already knew the movements of her prey. A heart once promised yet cast aside, a vow unspoken, a truth denied. Yet secrets buried rise anew, and debts unpaid will claim their due. Matthew set his glass down with a loud thud on the nearby table. A footman flinched. Helena finished the poem with a slight tilt of her head and a smile that only he understood. A challenge, a reminder, a veiled threat. For a long moment no one moved. Then Viscount Redgrave, ever eager to ease tensions, forced a laugh. Brilliant! Such intensity, Lady Helena! The Duke must be quite touched. Matthew took a deep breath, once, twice. Then he crossed the room. You're playing with fire, he murmured, gripping her arm as the guests began to disperse. Helena didn't flinch, didn't pull away. On the contrary, she smiled. Ah, but the irony. You always did like the heat, didn't you, Matthew? He released her as if burned. No, he couldn't do this here in the middle of his own house, but he needed to talk to her. Now. My study. 5 minutes. His voice was low, sharp. And if you're as bold as you pretend to be, you'll have the decency to meet me there. Helena blinked, feigning innocence. Oh, decency was never my strong suit. She turned and vanished into the crowd. Matthew exhaled slowly. 5 minutes. If she came, everything would change. If she didn't, well, if she didn't, he would have to find another way to keep that secret buried. But he already knew the truth. Helena would come. She always did. Helena entered the study without knocking. Matthew was already there, standing by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand, as if the liquor could burn him less than the woman before him. She hadn't changed at all. And yet, she had changed. Everything. She closed the door slowly, watching him with a dangerous glint in her eyes. "It seems my poem displeased you, Your Grace." He took a long sip of his drink before responding. "Your poem was a pointless provocation." "Ah." She tilted her head. "Then it was a poem about you?" Matthew clenched his jaw. Damn her! She had always known exactly how to draw from him what she wanted. She stepped closer, the rustling of her skirts echoing in the silence of the study. "Tell me, Matthew, did you really think you'd never see me again?" He let out a dry laugh. "I hoped never to see you again." Her smile didn't falter, but something in her gaze darkened. "Yes, I imagine you did. It's easier to forget people when they don't have names, isn't it?" Matthew felt the impact of her words, like a punch to the chest. He swirled the glass in his hands, seeking refuge in anger. "What do you want, Helena?" She took another step, close enough for him to catch the scent of jasmine and defiance. "Oh, dear Duke, I only came to recite poetry. Don't play games with me." His voice was low, threatening, because he knew. He knew she wasn't here just for poetry. Helena sighed dramatically. "Very well, if you insist. I came to see the man who once made me a promise and then forgot me." Matthew closed his eyes for a brief moment. No, he never forgot her. That was years ago. His voice was rough. 3 years, she crossed her arms. 3 years since you left me that night. 3 years since your absence proved what I always knew. He turned to face her, his jaw tight. "And what did you always know?" Helena gave him a cold smile. "That you never intended to keep your promise." Silence, long, unbearable, heavy. Matthew finally broke the space between them, stepping closer, slowly, like a wolf circling its prey. Except he no longer knew who the prey was. "You know nothing about what happened that night," he said, each word laced with something dark. Helena lifted her chin. "Then enlighten me." He hesitated, because telling the truth meant tearing apart something he had kept buried for 3 years. But Helena never backed down. And maybe it was time. She knew. Matthew remained silent for a long moment. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the fireplace, and the tension was palpable, like a rope on the verge of snapping. Helena wasn't looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with expectation, as if she had always known he could never be the man he wanted to be, as if she had always understood, deep down, that the Duke harbored more secrets than anyone could ever imagine. I didn't know what else to do." His voice was softer now, a shadow of vulnerability slipping through. That was something he hadn't wanted to say. Not here, not to her. Helena didn't move, her gaze locked onto his. "The night you left me, you were desperate to be rid of me." Matthew swallowed hard. "You never knew the truth." "Oh, of course I do. I was just a distraction." She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "A foolish girl you used and discarded." That cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of those words, the words of someone he had loved, someone he still loved. It wasn't like that. He looked at her then, his eyes dark, heavy with something he had carried in silence. Because what he had done had not been a whim. "Helena didn't move. Then explain it to me." Matthew stepped forward, close enough that he could almost feel the warmth of her skin. He shut his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. "I left you because my father forced me to choose, and I couldn't risk losing everything, Helena." She took a step back, blinking, confused, indignant. "Your father? You left me because of him." He nodded, the weight of it still pressing on his shoulders. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see the filth I was raised in. He threatened me. My title, my inheritance, everything I had was at stake." Helena felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had always suspected there was more to his abandonment, but this was worse than anything she had imagined. "So you chose to lose me rather than fight for me." He stepped closer, now only inches away, his gaze locked onto hers. "I didn't know how to fight, and everything I had ever known told me. I had to preserve my name, my position. I was afraid." Helena's heart pounded harder at every word. She felt a mixture of anger and something else, compassion. But no matter what she felt, what he had done could not be erased. Not so easily. "And what do you want from me now, Matthew? Do you want me to forgive you?" He shook his head, the conflict evident in his expression. "I don't want forgiveness, Helena. I want you to see me as the man I am now. Not the man I was." She stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The anger, the pain, it all began to fade. And in their place, something new took root, something unresolved, something unfinished. And then she reached out, just a small gesture, but enough for him to step closer. Her dark, gleaming eyes burned with fire, and for a moment it felt as if the past no longer mattered. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Matthew, but perhaps somehow we can try." He looked at her, intensity in his gaze. "I never expected you to forgive me, but at least let me try. Let me show you who I really am." Without another word, he moved forward. Matthew didn't think, or if he did, he chose to ignore every sliver of reason warning him against what he was about to do. Because Helena was still there. Because, despite everything, she still challenged him with those dark eyes that set his chest ablaze, like a match struck too close to gunpowder. And perhaps because he had never stopped wanting her, his fingers brushed against her wrist, a touch both light and firm. He wanted to give her a chance to pull away, but Helena Armitage never pulled away. So when his lips met hers, it was not a mistake. It was a fire. The kiss was hard, intense, like 3 years of pain, regret, and longing crashing all at once. Helena was no timid, demure lady. She kissed him back with the same fury, her fingers sliding into his hair, pulling him closer. She tasted like aged wine, intoxicating, dangerous. He let himself drown in the moment, in the heat, in the memories of what they had been and what they could have been. But she was the one to break the kiss first, breathless, eyes wide, as if she had just committed a sin and liked it. This changes nothing." Her voice was hoarse but weak, as if she was trying to convince herself. Matthew slid a finger under her chin, tilting her face up to his. "It changes everything, Helena." She opened her mouth to argue, but a noise in the hallway made them freeze. Voices, footsteps, then a sharp knock on the door. Matthew stepped back at once, his expression turning cold, unreadable. Helena straightened her gown, smoothing away any trace of vulnerability behind her mask of steel. "Enter," Matthew commanded. The door swung open with force. It was Redgrave, but he wasn't smiling. "Forgive the intrusion, Ravenshire, but—" He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Helena before continuing. "There's a problem." Matthew frowned. "What kind of problem?" Redgrave hesitated only for a second before saying, "Someone has discovered what happened 3 years ago." Helena inhaled sharply. Matthew felt his stomach drop. The past was about to catch up with them. Helena felt her heart race, but her expression remained steady. She had learned long ago that fear only gave power to the enemy. Matthew, on the other hand, couldn't disguise his tension. "Explain yourself, Redgrave." The Viscount glanced between Helena and Matthew, as if carefully choosing his words. This was no ordinary problem. It was serious. Something big. "I received an anonymous note just minutes ago," Redgrave began, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Delivered by an unknown footman. No signature, but the message is clear." Matthew took the note and read it quickly. "The Duke may hide his past from the world, but not from me. He should prepare himself, because the truth will be revealed. Before the night is over." His jaw clenched. This was no empty threat. Helena crossed her arms. "And what exactly does this truth involve?" Redgrave cast a wary glance at Matthew before answering. "What happened 3 years ago?" Helena's breath caught in her throat. Matthew felt a knot tighten in his chest. "This cannot leave this room." Redgrave nodded. "I already burned the note, but if someone had the nerve to send it, it means they know something. And if they know, then soon all of London will know." Helena finished. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew turned to the fireplace, bracing, a hand against the carved mantel, his gaze lost in the flames. "Only 3 people know the truth. Me, you, and—" Helena met his gaze, solemn. "Your father." The mere mention of the late Duke of Ravenshire made something dark settle in Matthew's expression. "He took secrets to the grave," Matthew said, but the uncertainty in his voice was unmistakable. "If someone else knows, then—" Helena completed his thought. "Either he told someone before he died, or there's another witness we haven't considered." Redgrave ran a hand over his face, impatient. "Which means we have very little time to find out who this person is and what they want." Matthew turned, locking eyes with Helena. "This could ruin you." She lifted a shoulder as if she didn't care. "My reputation is already a battlefield, Your Grace. But yours—" Baizur didn't need to finish the sentence. He knew if the truth came out, he would lose everything, and the worst part. It was Helena who was in the most danger. Matthew crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders, his expression fierce. "Tell me one thing, Helena, and be honest. Do you trust me?" Helena blinked, caught off guard. She should say no. He had abandoned her once before, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw something different. He was not the same man. So after a long moment, she answered softly, "Yes." Matthew exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Then we need to act before this threat destroys us." She nodded. "And what's the plan, Duke?" He set his jaw. "First, we find out who's behind this." Helena arched a brow. "And then?" Matthew's gaze burned into hers, possessive, unyielding. "Then I protect you at any cost," she smirked, taunting. "I hope you're ready, Matthew, because this might be harder than you think." He didn't look away. "I've never been a man who ran from a fight." And now he knew. This was the battle that mattered more than any other. The battle to save not just his reputation, but the woman he had never stopped loving. Helena followed Matthew through the dimly lit corridors of the manor, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The anonymous threat was just the beginning. Now they needed to uncover who knew what had happened 3 years ago, and what they intended to do with that information. Matthew stopped in front of a door, gripping the handle firmly. Helena recognized the room instantly. The late Duke of Ravenshire's old study. "You really think the answer is in here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Matthew glanced over his shoulder at her. "My father was never a trustworthy man. If someone knew about his involvement in what happened that night, the evidence would be here." He lit a candelabrum and strode toward the desk. Helena watched as he rummaged through drawers, documents, and old parchment. There was something different about him now. The Duke had always been a fortress of control, but now he looked like a man on the edge of a precipice. And perhaps she was too. Helena moved toward a nearby cabinet, running her fingers over the leather-bound books. When she pulled one from the shelf, something unexpected happened. A faint click, followed by the groaning of shifting wood. She froze. Matthew spun on his heel. What was that? Helena blinked, then pulled the book again. This time, a section of the bookshelf slid back, revealing a hidden compartment. She cast a smug look at Matthew. Seems your father had a taste for secrets. Matthew was already beside her, reaching into the hidden space to pull out a bundle of papers. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his face paled. Helena stepped closer. What is it? He looked up at her, his expression grim. This isn't just about us. He handed her the papers, and as Helena read, a chill ran down her spine. The late Duke had been involved in something far bigger and far more dangerous than simply interfering in his son's romance. This could bring down not only Matthew but other powerful figures in the aristocracy. Helena inhaled sharply. Who else knows about this? Matthew clenched his fists. If someone is threatening us with this secret, then it means they already have proof. She bit her lip. This changes everything. Before they could say more, a noise in the hallway made them go rigid. Footsteps, swift, determined. Someone was coming. Matthew snuffed out the candle instantly and grabbed Helena's wrist, pulling her. Behind the door, she collided against him, feeling his warmth, his scent, and for a fleeting moment danger wasn't the only thing stealing her breath away. The footsteps stopped just outside the study. Matthew held his breath. They were seconds away from being discovered. The doorknob began to turn. Helena shut her eyes, knowing that in 1 second everything could come crashing down. But just before the door could open fully, a deep voice echoed down the hall. "Ah, my lord, the Countess of Wiltshire wishes to speak with your grace." Helena recognized Redgrave's voice and exhaled in relief. He had distracted the intruder just in time. The footsteps retreated, and Matthew finally released a slow breath. They stood, there for a moment, still too close, still feeling the adrenaline pulse between them, and that was when Helena realized. Matthew was still holding her hand. She lifted her gaze to his. The danger hadn't passed, but in that moment the tension between them shifted into something else. "We should go," Matthew murmured, but he didn't move. Helena wet her lips. Yes. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched, dense, electric, and then Matthew did the one thing neither of them should have done. He lowered his head and kissed her again. The kiss was a mistake, and yet it was inevitable. Helena knew it the moment Matthew's lips met hers, because she didn't pull away. She didn't push him back. On the contrary, she was the one who rose onto her toes and pulled him closer. If the first kiss had been an explosion of rage and suppressed desire, this one was dangerous, because it was more than just desire. Matthew held her tight, his hands sliding to her waist, fingers pressing into the curve of her back, as if he wanted to carve her existence into him. She was real. She was here. Finally. But it was Helena who broke away, breathless. She swallowed hard. This cannot happen. Matthew was silent for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on her. He was tired of fighting what he felt, but he knew Helena was still fighting it. "Then why did it?" he asked, voice rough. She had no answer. Because she knew the truth. She had never stopped loving him, but the past still lingered, a shadow between them. Before either of them could say anything else, a sharp knock on the door forced them apart. Redgrave entered in a hurry, his face clouded with concern. Another note. He extended a piece of paper toward Matthew, who took it, a knot forming in his stomach. Helena stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. "You may burn letters and hide secrets, but you cannot erase the past. The Duke may try to protect his poetess, but will it be enough when the truth comes to light?" A chill ran down Helena's spine. They know about us, she murmured. Matthew clenched his fists. This cannot spread. Redgrave sighed. The problem is, it already has. The whispers have begun. And if we don't find out who's behind this soon... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Helena crossed her arms, deep in thought. This wasn't just blackmail. Someone wanted more, and she needed to find out who, before it was too late. She looked at Matthew. I think I know where to start. Matthew arched a brow. And where would that be? Helena's lips curled into a sharp smile. If she had learned anything in the last 3 years, it was that words could be weapons. And she was about to use them. The only way to end a scandal, she said, is to make the truth far more interesting than the lie. Matthew let out a slow breath. Which means you have a plan. She grinned. It means I am the plan. Helena had never liked waiting. If life had taught her anything, it was that those who waited were the ones who lost. So that very night, as whispers about her and the Duke began to circulate through the ballroom, she decided to act. The power games of the aristocracy were like a chessboard, and Helena had always been better at making the moves than being a piece. So while the ladies whispered behind their fans and the gentlemen exchanged knowing glances filled with curiosity and scorn, Helena did exactly what no one expected. She sought out the rumors, and she fed them. Matthew found her minutes later, standing in the middle of the ballroom, laughing and conversing with the Duchess of Wexley, one of society's greatest gossips. He strode toward her, his anger barely restrained. By the need for discretion, Helena, he said through clenched teeth, taking her arm, what exactly are you doing? She smiled, as if he had simply asked whether she wanted more tea. Turning the story in my favor. Matthew scowled. An explanation would be appreciated. Helena tilted her head. If they are going to spread rumors about us, they might as well spread the right ones. The Duke ran a hand down his face, exasperated. Helena, she lifted a finger, cutting him off. Think, Matthew. Until now we've been on the defensive. Someone wants to expose us. But what if we expose ourselves first? Matthew blinked. Absorbing her words, Helena smiled triumphant. If we give the public a story they can't resist, the one our enemy wants to tell will become irrelevant. Matthew's expression darkened. And what, pray tell, is this irresistible story? She met his gaze, challenge shining in her eyes. A betrothal. Matthew couldn't help it. He laughed, a short, incredulous sound, filled with disbelief. And perhaps a touch of admiration. So this is your solution. He cocked his head. Create a bigger scandal. Helena smirked. Better to own your own ruin than be a victim of it, don't you think? He studied her for a long moment. She was serious, and the most terrifying thing? It was brilliant. If he announced an engagement to Helena, the rumors would transform into romantic gossip. Society adored a forbidden love story, but there was one problem. He wanted it to be real. Matthew cleared his throat. And if I say this idea is madness, Helena arched a brow, then I'll say all good ideas are. The Duke exhaled slowly. He was lost, and for the first time he didn't want to be found. But before they could say another word, a footman approached, handing an envelope to Helena. She opened it carefully, scanning the contents. Her face paled. Matthew noticed instantly. What is it? Helena lifted her gaze to him, and for the first time that night fear flickered in her eyes. The person threatening us. Her voice was unsteady. They want to meet me, tomorrow, at midnight. Matthew felt his blood run cold. No, this was no longer a game. This was real danger. Epilogue. The night was cold. The kind of cold that seeped into the bones, whispering that something was about to happen. Helena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the dark garden courtyard. She shouldn't be there, but it was far too late for regrets. The anonymous note had demanded she come alone. Matthew, of course, had refused. "If you think I'm going to let you meet a blackmailer in the dead of night without protection, then you clearly don't know me as well as you think," he had said earlier, furious. And now, hidden in the shadows, the Duke was there. Helena stopped at the center of the garden, the icy wind brushing against her skin. Then, footsteps. A figure emerged from the darkness, and Helena froze. No, it can't be. Matthew stepped out of his hiding place the instant he saw who it was, his eyes widening in shock. Viscount Redgrave. Helena felt a tight knot form in her stomach. You? You were behind this?" Redgrave sighed, shaking his head. "I never wanted it to come to this." Matthew took a step forward, his posture like steel. "Explain. Now." Redgrave ran a hand through his hair, visibly troubled. "Your father asked me to watch over you, Matthew. 3 years ago, he knew about you and Helena. And when he died, he hesitated. I kept his secrets. But then someone else found out." Helena held her breath. "So you weren't threatening us, you were warning us." Redgrave nodded. "Someone wants to destroy you both. I tried to mislead them, but I failed. Now you need to run." Helena exchanged a look with Matthew. Run? No, she had spent years fighting the aristocracy with sharp words and sharper wit, and Matthew had spent years trying to protect a name that perhaps had never been worth saving. She didn't want to run. She wanted to fight. And for the first time, Matthew thought the same. He took Helena's hand and squeezed it, a silent choice, a promise. Then he turned to Redgrave. "We're not going anywhere." Helena smiled. "If someone wants to destroy us, let them try." The night no longer felt so cold.